keep this ball rolling. Please welcome to the stage a voice that you're probably all very familiar with. I know I listen to him absolutely daily. The Daily executive host, Michael Barbaro, in conversation with Alexis Williams. Give it up for them.
It is nearly 1:30 a.m. on the morning after Election Day. It's been a really long night. It's going to be a really long morning. And we are going to head into the studio and unpack everything that we know and don't know about the results. I'm Michael Barbaro, and this is The Daily.
All right. Good morning. Yeah, Michael, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for being here. I was just telling you that Stagwell and The Daily were basically born in the same moment.
It's true.
So congratulations to what you all have done. It's extraordinary.
Well, thank you. That's very generous. We appreciate it. And thank you for your time. I guess in terms of what you've built, because in fact you are the subject of the interview today, a little brag on what Michael's done with The Daily, because it's really incredible. So you are Apple's most listened to podcast. You have 4 billion downloads and 500 million all-time streams. I think those are the right stats. You have 2 new hosts in Natalie Kidrick and Rachel Abrams, and really, The Daily has changed how people consume news. It really took a platform that was burgeoning in podcasts and made news central to it. So it's great to have you here, and really you embody the notion of innovation that news is looking for so much. So thank you. All right, so to start out, I think there's probably a lot of Daily fans in the audience, so you don't need much of an intro, but anyone who listens knows you're born in Connecticut, son of a firefighter and a librarian, went to Yale and then kind of got the news bug and traveled along from, I guess it was the Washington Post to New York Times. Tell us about what did that early learning, what did that time really, as a beat reporter, teach you about where you are now and how you feel about news?
Sure. I mean, I always express a lot of sympathy for people who say that they didn't know what they wanted to be when they grew up, because I did. I did, like, in a DNA level, and it was because of where I grew up in just outside New Haven, Connecticut. My sister and I, through this really weird set of events, inherited a local paper route, and so we were newspaper carriers, proud carriers of the New Haven Register. We woke up every morning at 5:50 a.m. to bundle the newspaper, and on Sundays my mom and dad opened up the hatchback of the Subaru and would drive down the road, and we would grab the Sunday paper out of the trunk, because I don't know if you know this, but on Sunday, this is all like a vestige of another era. The paper's too big to carry in a newspaper carrier bag, and that newspaper carrier bag still sits in my bedroom in Brooklyn Heights, New Haven Register. It's like 30 years old and perfectly darkened from newspapers. I don't want to wash it. And I think the act of opening up the newspaper every morning, like literally taking the yellow plastic and breaking it open and smelling it and delivering it, was the defining metaphor of my youth. Like, I'm bringing people the news, and it kind of never got over that act, and it kind of pursued it through every internship, paid or unpaid, imaginable, from the Hamden Chronicle to the Miami Herald to eventually the Washington Post, not overlapping with the Great Abbey. And then in 2005, the New York Times. Often, by the way, on beats that I didn't want to have. I mean, that's just the nature of journalism. I covered biotechnology in Maryland. I think you have to. It actually remains an industry that you got to put in your dues.
Yeah, so from biotechnology in Maryland to today, having an interview with the mayoral candidate, Madami, so quite the range. Well, one of the quotes I heard from you is that you said listening is an underrated skill. And so I want to take that kernel of an idea and tie it to when you launched The Daily in 2017. Combine that notion of you've covered a lot of beats, you've been in a lot of places, you think there's not enough listening, audience coming together. How did that sort of zeitgeist come together to start The Daily in 2017, and how much of a risk did it feel like when you took that leap?
Well, you're completely asking the right question, and since we're talking about innovation here, I think the insight we had in 2017 at the New York Times with the launch of The Daily was that there was a pretty big hole in the world of audio and podcasting. I don't know if you remember that era, but it was the era of serial. Cereal, 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 cereal. Everyone was talking about cereal. Everyone was talking about This American Life. A lot of the energy was around narrative audio storytelling. And here we are, a newspaper, trying to create a robust podcasting department. And the thinking was, could we marry these two instincts, news and narrative and audio? And we dreamed up this literal phrase for what we were going to make. We're going to call it narrative news. We were going to take the journalistic chops and instincts of the New York Times newsroom and ask them to transform it into a much more informal, dramatic, suspenseful form of storytelling in audio. And the question was, could you pull it off? Could you convince reporters to sit down in front of a microphone and tell a story in a profoundly different way than they had been used to? Because the way that journalists tell stories is news, context, quote, kicker, right? Like it's a formula. And so people would come into the studio and be like, all right, we're gonna have you unfold this story in an intentional, dramatic, suspenseful way over 30 minutes, and they would vomit out the story. And I'd be like, okay, well, so I have to ask a question, or this doesn't work. And so it was this real process, and we basically had to, we had to coach our colleagues who were extraordinarily generous about it through a new form of storytelling. But what was amazing was how game they were and how untapped the whole newsroom was. It turned out for like decades, our colleagues had been running around with, this won't surprise you, recording every interview they did and then just deleting it. And we're like, well, what if you don't delete that recording and you just email it to us? We transform it and maybe we have you talk around it. And then maybe we'll go out in the field with you with a microphone. You know, if you listen to today's Daily, it's like 8 years of the distillation of that. We go to a Zoran Bogdani campaign event, and that's all you hear for the first 7 minutes of the episode before we then are in an interview with him. And it's very interactive, you're really going someplace, and there's this long journey of a conversation we have with him about his efforts to win over his skeptics, who are many since he won his primary. And so it's been a long journey. At times it's been a little bumpy. We definitely had a lot of, there's a steep learning curve on both sides for us in our public industry.
And so then dovetailing off that though, part of what I think listeners love about The Daily is it's not all the headlines. It has a real curatorial element to it. There is something that makes something a daily story as opposed to just a news story. How do you think about in a day there can be 15 breaking news stories? How do you curate what makes sense, and what does that do in terms of the connection you have with your audience? How do you think about those two?
Yeah, I mean, we have really tortured conversations about this every day. What is the right version of the way to tell a story? And I'll give you a case study because I think it illustrates how painstaking this process can be. Because the moment that we're in, and here I will openly talk about the concept of brand safety, which I think is a phrase that I never ever wanted to understand, but now understand better than I ever imagined. And our responsibility is to take a big, complicated, frequently dark universe of news and make you feel like listening to it helps you understand the world and not want to go jump off a bridge. And I don't know if you remember a couple months back, there was a terrible flood in Texas that destroyed an all-girls Christian summer camp campus. In no world did I want to wake up the next morning and hear a daily episode that reconstructed the horrors of that singularly awful event. So we turned it over in our head for about 48 hours, and we decided that the best way to cover that tragedy was to turn it into a celebration of the central character of that story, which was summer camp. This universal experience. So we found this woman who was an alum of the camp, and we really liked her spirit. We didn't have a lot of time. It was going to be the next day's show, and just kind of rolled the dice. Interviewed her for about an hour and a half, and the flood was like 3/4 into the episode because she spent the majority of the time reconstructing her childhood memories of a place and a moment in her life that were so vivid. It was like she could smell and taste the first day of girls' camp 35 years later. And we got this feedback after we published the episode that it was cathartic, that this was a relief. This was a way of thinking about a tragic news event in an entirely different way. And I think that's the discipline over the last 7 years that we've developed of like, how are we going to make the news human, digestible, visceral, and not dramatic?
Yeah.
And it does well. It was a huge amount of trust because we can just see it in the feedback. People are like, once again, didn't think I needed this episode, didn't know if it was going to connect with me, and it did.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that's so special about the Daily Duty. We were talking about this backstage. You can go from hard news and really tough stories to, I fangirled around the Gatsby episode and celebrating the anniversary of that book, and so that connection brings the totality of humanity together in an audio, which is really neat. So you brought up brand safety, and that's a lot of why we're here, which is how do we get advertisers to engage more with news? Why should they engage with news, and what's the value? And I think that's a really important conversation. But I actually want to start with how the Daily thinks about advertising, because you and I both grew up in newsrooms, church and state, editorial sales, those lines do not cross. And what we're seeing is a real evolution in how brands can work with news. And audio is really at the forefront of that, and was, and continues to be. So how do you think about where brands plug in, how they plug in? Obviously, your content is on its own, but there's huge value in those spaces within the audio itself. So just talk a little bit about some of those partnerships and what you've seen and the evolution in news as it relates to that.
Yeah, I mean, I'll tell you the truth, which is that brands would love for the ads on the Daily to be host read. The Times won't go there. So that's our the church state concession. But brands have been at the center of the Daily since BMW took a huge bet on our show back in 2017. And I'm pretty sure it's regarded as one of the best bets in podcasting history because they were given a deal, they were promised some infinitesimally small number of listens that then hit like 1 million in the first year of Daily listeners. So brands, understood the intimacy and the kind of the proposition that this show was going to be different than any other news show, and that our listeners were going to be fiercely loyal to it, and our listening through rates are just extremely high. Once people start listening, they don't stop until the credits of the show. And I routinely have conversations with brands about what the show is. That is a new development. That is something I did when I was a young pup coming up in journalism. And I don't have any compunction about that because I believe in what it is we're making, and I really want, whether it's a CMO or a sales rep, whoever it is, to understand how we make our decisions, why I think we are a safe and thoughtful place, even in a very complicated news environment, for them to advertise. And I think that conversation is really important to have, and it's important to have in person.
Yeah, and it's, to your point, it's an evolution that maintains editorial integrity, but that's brands understand the value of your audience, understand the power of news and all those pieces. So then, continuing in sort of the brand front, the Daily really is at the forefront of storytelling. I think a lot of what you do is there. What advice would you give to any marketers, business leaders in the room about how to tell your story in this moment? It's only going to get more complicated with AI. There's so much content out there. How do you talk about how you started the Daily, but how do you think, what's breakthrough now? How do you think about that? And what advice would you give to brands in terms of what that looks like in this moment?
Well, it's funny, Abby talked about viral moments, which I think are essential to what her show does. I would say that the Daily is not a bastion of viral moments. I think each and every one of you, this is almost a cliche, because one of your world kind of like knows what the DNA of your brand is. And for us, the Daily had to be an expression of New York Times journalism that matched the DNA of the New York Times company. And I think that is the lesson of the way we tell stories. Like, yes, we completely transformed how our colleagues are telling stories, but with all of the kind of boundaries and borders and kind of DNA level, thoughtfulness of the New York Times brand. We've never strayed from that. I mean, even when a colleague like Taffy Hackner, who's a magazine writer, comes on the show and breaks down and cries as she thinks about what a Taylor Swift song lyric means to her because it reminds her of the time that she discovered she was paid less than her male counterparts at an unnamed magazine that resides in New York. It was like this is totally fair game. It's totally different than the rest of New York Times journalism, but it has all the integrity of New York Times journalism. And I think that's been the breakthrough. There are all kinds of things we would never do. Like we just talked about this, I don't really do book tours. I'm not going to be the 30th interview you do on your book tour, because that doesn't feel special, and that doesn't feel like our brand. We get offered occasionally celebrities who want to come on the Daily. It's like, is that really who we are? It'd be exciting. I'd love that selfie, but is that who we are? And so a lot of the discipline of our show is the episode we're not making.
Yeah, that's a great push, because sometimes we do focus so much on who we are, but also being clear on the guardrails of what we aren't, and then importantly, what our consumers wouldn't expect from us, and why that would be.
Okay, all that said, I made an Ina Garden exception last year, because we had this, Thanksgiving is where we kind of suspend the rules. I might go hunting for a goose in a couple of weeks with somebody.
Spoiler alert.
But it's like, but also Ina Garden, and the conversation we had about the art and craft of hosting, it didn't feel off-brand to us, and it didn't feel like we were just hanging out with lifestyles that are too famous. It felt like something that our listeners would be delighted by, and I think they were.
I was. I'm sure others in the room were as well. Well, that's a great segue because we're almost out of time, but I want to go back to what you've done with the Daily and some of the interviews. So, what interview has sort of stuck with you? What's the most interesting interview you've ever done in the course of the Daily?
So, the interview I'll never get past, obviously you can see how my brain works, but I think we can find a person in the world who embodies a big, messy story with all the emotion and complexity that's possible is when it is what I want the Daily to be. And so during the pandemic, as all of us were grappling with just the extraordinary scale of loss, we went out and found a young woman named Tilly, whose grandfather had contracted COVID and who had died. And we had a 35-minute episode in which I spoke to her about her grandfather, who was a minister, and who would take her out onto the rooftop of his house at night with a sleeping bag to camp and look at the stars. And it was just, sometimes it feels like you can drift so far from the moment at hand, and then the art of bringing it back to where we are. And this young woman described sorrow and pain as a series of colors, because she's 12 years old, right? So we were talking about like what shape, what color is this pain you have in your heart right now, and she goes to sleep with her grandfather's shirt on now because it reminds her of him. And so that's an interview I'll never forget, because it was a deeply humanizing, deeply special version of we are living in the middle of something we've never experienced before.
I remember that episode. It was really touching, and while it feels like a lifetime ago, it brings you back in a way that reminds you of where we've gone. So that's great. And now, next question: if you could interview anyone, dead or alive, who would it be?
Okay, I always have a stock answer for this, even though it's a little bit of a cliche. I would go to Billy Joel's house. I would sit down with him. He'd play. I'd ask. I'm like, if you look closely enough at MSG on any given weekday, I'm there, singing and swaying. My wife profoundly disagrees with me that his music is poetry. But I say, look past the big hits, so they're kind of truly lyrical songs, right? The ones that seem like they're almost just a little too long. And I think it's poetry. So I'd probably sit down with Billy Joel, even though it may be because he has a documentary that's out. But honestly, the reality is I don't know that would make a great Daily. So that's why we haven't done it.
That's attention.
Yeah.
Knowing what you are and what you aren't, right?
Yeah, and knowing that it's not, somehow it's not all about you.
Yeah. All right, so last question. What's the one thing you've learned about yourself through the interviews you've done and the journey you've been on with the Daily?
I mean, I've learned that there are lots of different forms of listening. It turns out, maybe this won't surprise you because you know people like this in your life, I'm not actually a great listener when I'm not listening for my job. I have this ability to tune people out when I'm doing my work that actually makes me not a great listener until suddenly I'm supposed to be listening. And I'm listening on like 3 or 4 different levels of like, what are you telling me? Where do I need to go next? And then also trying to be responsive to the emotion that I'm experiencing. And so I've learned this complicated thing about myself, which is that I'm a professionally, I guess, gifted listener who in my personal life can be a terrible listener. And that is pretty irreconcilable. And yet, that's what I've learned about myself.
All right, well, that's a great end. Thank you so much, Michael. Thank you for your time.